Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday to you. This is Adrian with PrepAgent, and today we're going to be talking about property ownership. Um, if you can hear me, go ahead and type in the chat where you're from. Looks like a bunch of you have been doing that already, but we do this so that you can see other people in your area, maybe connect if you're looking for a study group. And the best way to get that information out there without being too invasive is for y'all to just throw it up in the chat if you're comfortable with that and letting people know where you're from. Nice. It looks like everybody can hear me. We've got some Oregon, studying for Washington State, Boston, North Carolina, Georgia, Long Beach, Clarksville, Tennessee. Good representation of all over the place here. So this morning we are going to be sort of doing a general overview of a bunch of property ownership type stuff. So let's go ahead and start with one of the basics that we all need to know. Ooh, Longview, Washington. I've been there. Never been to Philly, PA, but I hear great things. Unless you're a sports fan. I hear the sports up there is pretty tough. Or they're tough on their sports fans. Or on their sports teams, I mean. Getting back to property ownership. We're just going to launch right into it because we got a lot of people with exams coming up. Monica's got a little bit of time, but I know that somebody I saw was taking their exam later today. And I know a couple other people I know a couple other people are taking them later in the week. So the first thing I want to talk about, and what I'm looking for here is a short definition, not an example. But encroachment. Does anybody have a good short definition for what an encroachment is? I'm sure you've all got plenty of examples, but, encumbrance, not an encroachment. Well, go ahead and let's start with encroachment. Anybody tell me what an encroachment is? Because these are all connected. We're going to be talking about a lot of these. David Alvarez says intrusion, trespassing. Julio says across the line. Those are all great examples of what an encroachment is. So all encroachments are encumbrances, but not all encumbrances are encroachments. Does anybody have a good definition for an encumbrance? What an encumbrance is, and sort of what I'm looking for here. If any of you use our vocabulary worksheet, then you know that in Joe's instructional video, he sort of directs you to put the shortest definition that makes sense in there. And the reason for that is because we want definitions to be in your own words and to be short enough for you to be able to remember them. So an easement is a great example of an encumbrance. But Flygirl Ray has a really good definition. Any limitation or restriction on the property. That's a really good way of looking what an encumbrance is. And the reason that I want you all to think about that, not just to know that, an encroachment is an encumbrance or an easement is an encumbrance. The reason it's good to know a little bit of a short definition is so that if it comes up on your exam and it doesn't give you any keywords, all you see is encumbrance, you still have an idea of what that is, and so you can reason out or you can rationalize what the correct answer is if you don't also see encumbrance or encroachment or lien or easement. Makes sense to everybody? So the other thing that we want to cover before we launch into today are the types of estates. So we have two major classifications of estates, freehold and less than freehold. What are the three examples of freehold estates that we talk about? What are the three types of freehold estates that we talk about when studying for the exam? Freehold estates, we're talking about ownership, right? So Eric Montenegro says fee simple. Flygirl Ray says life estates. fee simple defeasible, fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, and life estates. And those are all forms of ownership. What about the less than freehold estates? We talk about 4 different kinds of less than freehold estates. William Fiddler, sorry, I believe I just saw you saying that that's not actually your name, but says absolute, fee simple, and life, question mark, and I'm saying exclamation point, absolute, fee simple, and life. And those are the freehold estates. Less than freehold estates, we are talking about estate for years, as Brandy said. And for those of you that are confused or maybe not sure, less than freehold estates and leasehold estates are the same thing. We're talking about the same thing there. 2 different ways of looking at the same concept. So Marta Grissom says estate at will, estate for years, estate at sufferance, and periodic tenancy. That is perfect. Those are all the different types of leasehold estates or less than freehold estates. So with less than freehold estates, we're not talking about ownership of the property. If you hold a leasehold estate, what do you actually have? What right do you have with a leasehold estate? Does anybody have an idea? Any thoughts? What do you actually hold with a leasehold estate? Brian says a bundle of rights. Not quite, Brian. You have a couple of rights, one in particular that I'm thinking of. But the bundle of rights comes with ownership. That comes with the freehold estates, not leasehold estates. Mark Newman, first to hit the nail on the head. Possession. You have the right to possess and occupy, and that's about the only right that you have with a leasehold estate out of those bundle of rights that you're given. I think there's a couple others, out of the full bundle of rights. But the right of possession is the main right that you get with a lease. You also, with a lease, get control. So real quick then, because we're talking about the bundle of rights, what are the 5 rights that come in the bundle of rights? Eric Montenegro says the right to sublease. So that is the right of disposition, Eric, and you are correct. Unless your lease states otherwise, you do have the right to sublease. And you do have the right to enjoy. What about the other rights? So there's the right of enjoyment, the right of possession that we've already covered. A bunch of you are saying deep sea, so we want to see what deep sea is. We want to make sure you know what deep sea stands for. So we're talking about the right of possession, the right of control, the right of exclusion, and the right of enjoyment, and then disposition, as Brandy said. So with the leasehold estate, you're going to get the right of possession, the right of control, and the right of enjoyment. As we talked about earlier, you can get some of the right of disposition in the sense that you can sublease, but you can't really sell or transfer ownership, which are 2 of the big components of the right of disposition, right? And then exclusion, you're limited with your right of exclusion because the owner of the property will always have a right to enter the property as well. All right, great intro, everybody. Nice work. Got a lot of great answers. So now we are going to jump into the question on the board. And before we do that, Eric asks, is that how Airbnb hosts are making money by subleasing? Yeah, if you are renting an apartment and you lease it out through Airbnb, then you're absolutely subleasing. If you own your property, then you're just sort of leasing it as an estate for years, right? For a defined period of time. So even if your Airbnb rental is only for 3 days, that is still called an estate for years. Anybody know? Anybody know why a 3-day rental is still called an estate for years? Anybody have a wild guess at what particular component of estate for years makes a sublease or an Airbnb lease an estate for years. Eric Montenegro says ending date. Julio agrees. It's the ending date. It's a fixed period of time, says Brandy. You are all correct. That is the important part. You're getting the place for a defined period of time. You have an exact start and end time. Well done. All right, first question on the board. A landowner divided much of her land into smaller parcels and has recently sold a tract adjacent to a nature preserve. The preserve and the tract that was sold are landlocked and cannot be entered except through one of the other tracts still belonging to the landowner. The buyer of the tract will probably be granted what type of easement by a court action? A. Conditional use permit. B. Easement by necessity. C. Easement by prescription. Or D. Easement in gross. What does everybody think here? What type of easement will the buyer of this tract be granted? So I'm going to reread the question for those who are just listening. A landowner divided much of her land into smaller parcels and has recently sold a tract adjacent to a nature preserve. The preserve and the tract that was sold are landlocked and cannot be entered except through one of the other tracts still belonging to the landowner. The buyer of the tract will probably be granted what type of easement by a court action? The answer is B, easement by necessity. So we had some confusion on this one. Some people threw up easement by prescription as a possibility. What is the defining characteristic of an easement by prescription? For you to be granted a prescriptive easement, different way of saying easement by prescription, right? So for you to be granted a prescriptive easement, what is the main component that is considered? Not force, Julio, although I know why you're thinking that, but that's not what we're talking about. And you're welcome, Bill. Appreciate your thanks. And it was good for me too to serve in the military. I think that just about everybody should, because at the very least, you learn how to make your bed. So let me see. A lot of people are saying adverse possession. Ooh, Mark hit it. Continued use, continuous use. So more so what I was looking for is time, right? With an easement by prescription, you had to have been using the land that you're looking for an easement for. You had to have been using that land for a certain amount of time. In a lot of places, it can be anywhere from 7 to 20 years, depending on your state. But mostly we're looking at the fact that you've been using it for a long time. And so that's the main component of an easement by prescription, whereas an easement by necessity, I have to use your land to get to my land. Sorry, like I don't want to do it, but it's necessary for me to get to my landlocked tract of land. And then what about an easement in gross? What is the defining characteristic of an easement in gross? Any thoughts there? Easement in gross. So we have an easement by necessity. I need to use your land to get to mine. An easement by prescription. I've been using your land long enough that it should be mine or that I should have a right to it. And with an easement in gross, Rachel and Marta say it goes with the person. That is the defining characteristic of an easement in gross. So those of you that wrote down in a utility company, that's our most common example of an easement in gross. But what an easement in gross does is we're basically saying, okay, you, the utility company, you need to get to your lines regardless of the owner or if this land changes shape, if it gets resurveyed and split into 3 different lots, you're still not attaching to the land. We're attaching the easement to the utility so that the utility will always have the right to access the land. Make sense? I think that makes sense. So we are going to move on. A grandfather grants a life estate to his grandson and stipulates that on the grandson's death, the title to the property will pass to his son-in-law. The second estate is called A, an estate at sufferance, B, a remainder, C, an estate for years, or D, a reversion. What do you think here? Read the question carefully because there are details in how it's asked that could change your answer. It looks like there's no fooling you. Have a pretty good consensus here that if a grandfather grants a life estate to his grandson and stipulates that on the grandson's death, the title to the property will pass to his son-in-law, the second estate is called a remainder. It is called a remainder if the life estate passes to a third party after the death of the life tenant. So what would it be? What would need to happen for it to be called a reversion? Thanks, Cynthia. You're pretty awesome too. Representing Texas as only a true Texan can. So what do you think here? What would have to be the case in order for it to be called a reversion and not a remainder? Ooh, DJ David Alvarez on the ones and twos says it goes back to the grantor. So in order for this to be a reversionary interest, the estate would have to pass back to the grandfather after his grandson's death. Reverts back to the grantor. Remainder goes to a third person, a third party. Make sense? Next question. Which of the following liens usually would be given highest priority in dispersing funds from a foreclosure sale? A, a mechanic's lien for work started before the mortgage was made. B, unpaid real estate property taxes. C, a mortgage dated last year. Or D, a judgment rendered the day before foreclosure. What does everybody think here? Oh, DJ David Alvarez says, question. Apparently you're not that kind of DJ, David. I actually DJ'd for a bit in the early 2000s. A lot of Thievery Corporation, sort of like world beats driven type of music. If that rings a bell with anybody. It was a lot of fun, but not ultimately a healthy lifestyle. Playing music for people because people only want to hear that stuff when it's late and they're drinking. Back. Ooh, Allison Edwards. She's DJ. Nice work. A lot of fun, huh, Allison? What kind of music do you DJ? Chicago house music. Nice. Kind of got my start with Chicago house music. So, which of the following liens usually would be given highest priority in dispersing funds from a foreclosure sale? The answer is unpaid real estate property taxes. Ooh, Charles Bowie, also a DJ. Nice. Got a lot of artists on board today, all styles. I did a lot of that too, Charles. I did a lot of, the old school jazz like Nina Simone and Etta Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. They mix in really well with Thievery Corporation. Anyway, back on track. I could talk about that stuff all day, but somebody asked me to go a little bit more into depth here. So, why is it that unpaid real estate property taxes have priority here? We're talking about the priority of liens here, how liens are prioritized. Does anybody have an idea of why unpaid real estate property taxes are the first thing paid here? Oh, good luck to Martinez Celine 1490. Test tomorrow. Fingers crossed for you. As for my question regarding real estate property taxes, because of the government, because it's Uncle Sam, and they're always going to say they get their money first. William says, I thought mechanics were the first to be recorded. That is not quite correct there, William. So basically the way that priority of liens work is that the first lien that is recorded is generally the first lien to get paid back. So if I own a house and I have somebody come and install a pool and I only pay for half of that pool, they file a mechanics lien. So that mechanics lien is filed in January. Let's say I have a mortgage payment that I missed dated last year from last October. So they put a lien in dated last October. And then I have a judgment. Well, let's leave that one out because that will just confuse things. And then I also have unpaid real estate property taxes from this year in September. So normally under the priority of liens, they would say that the mortgage dated last year gets paid back first because it was recorded first. That lien was recorded first. Then the mechanics lien should get paid next because it was recorded second. The mortgage lien was recorded October of last year, mechanics lien in February of this year. So if the house is foreclosed, the mortgage should get paid first and the mechanics lien will get paid second. Real estate property taxes from this year gets jumped to the beginning of the line because the government says, look, we need to get paid for our property taxes first. And because we get to regulate everything you're doing, that's okay. We can say that even though these other two lien holders filed their liens first, we get paid first because we're Uncle Sam. And then if there's any money left over from the foreclosure, the mortgage lien will get paid. And then if there's any money left over from that, the mechanics lien will get paid. Does that make sense to everybody? Hope that makes sense to everybody. Namisha asks how a judgment compares to taxes. Judgment liens generally do not jump forward with a property, in this case, trying to think of the best way to say that, but in this case, a judgment lien, and so part of the reason for that is because a judgment lien attaches to all of your property, right? So they don't need to just foreclose your house to get paid back. They can repossess your car. They can repossess all your furniture. They can basically take anything. And so my guess is because they're not a specific lien, that they don't jump the line like real estate property taxes. But that's more of a legal, like a legal definition that I'm not qualified to speak to. All I can tell you for sure is that as far as your real estate exam is concerned, unpaid real estate property taxes are the ones that jump the line as far as priority of liens go. All right. Looks like everybody says that makes some sense to you. So hopefully it's a little more clear than mud. We kind of talked about this earlier, but let's get into it a little deeper here. We didn't talk about this specifically. So a tenant's lease has expired, but the tenant has not vacated the premises or negotiated a renewal lease. The landlord has not given the tenant permission to remain in the building. This situation is an example of A, an estate from period to period, B, a tenancy at sufferance, C, an estate for years, or D, a tenancy at will. When you guys are doing that, I'm going to check out the chat. You're welcome, Eric, for the explanations. I'm glad it helps. That's just sort of my style. I am probably an oversplainer. Have a tendency to explain way more than most people need, but in this situation works perfectly for us, right? So I'm glad y'all appreciate it. It looks like we have strong consensus here too. Tenant's lease has expired, but the tenant has not vacated the premises or negotiated a renewal lease. The landlord has not given the tenant permission to remain in the building. This situation is an example of tenancy at sufferance. So what what trying to think of the right way to ask this. What would it be if the landlord had given the tenant permission to remain in the building, but the situation remained the same? So everything about this question is the same. The tenant's lease expires. The tenant has not vacated or negotiated a renewal lease. But if the landlord had given the tenant permission to remain in the building, Julio Salcedo hit it on the head. It would be a tenancy at will. Eric Montenegro right behind him. Good call. Carrie Emmert, you are most welcome, and thank you for your thanks. I really appreciate it. It's weird. For the first 15 years after I got out of the Navy, I never got thanked for it. I must say, I like that about our society now, that people really do have a lot of appreciation for that. So thank you all for your consideration. It means a lot. A corporation takes title to real property, A, in severalty, B, as a trust, C, as a joint tenancy, or D, as a partnership. Brandy asks, what is my book going to be called? Joe was correct. I am currently writing a book, and it's the first of a series of short stories. And the whole series is going to be called Song of the Way. And there is a story behind that, but that's all I'm going to share for now. But I will make sure, if Joe and Arthur allow it, that I'll let y'all know when that's ready to go. Allison, yes, you can sing in the Navy. Joe did that once, and he sang it horribly. Not to mention that when we were in the Navy, when I was in the Navy in the 90s, we didn't really like the connection of that particular song to the Village People, but I think it's hilarious now. So, back to the question on the board, we did have some dissension here, some confusion. So a corporation takes title to real property in severalty, and William Fiedler hit the nail on the head there. A corporation is treated the same as a person. If y'all remember, I don't know, it was maybe 6 or 8, 10 years ago, sometime in the 2010s, there was a big court case that confirmed that corporations are treated as individuals in situations like this. And so that's why a corporation takes title to real property in severalty and as an individual. Bill asks, what's the definition of soul? I'm assuming, Bill, that you're asking about sole ownership. And so the sole owner of a property would be, say, Microsoft, not Bill Gates. Or I don't even think Bill Gates is a huge part other than a stockholder. But hopefully that makes sense. The corporation is considered a single entity rather than a bunch of entities. And I think that has to do, this is just me sort of spitballing and guessing here. I think it has to do with the ease in which that transaction can happen. If Microsoft buys a property and everybody on their board of trust has to sign off and be a partial owner of that property, it becomes really confusing really quick. So that's sort of my guess. The main thing you need to know for your exam is that a corporation is treated as an individual when it comes to property ownership. Makes sense? Makes sense. I think we got everybody's questions answered. Namisha asks, can a corporation hold it as a trust? I'm not sure about that, Namisha. I'm sure they can. I'm sure that there are situations in which that's beneficial. Just requires a lot more paperwork to do it that way. I think we can skip to that one. So an easement appurtenant to real property can be terminated by all of the following, except A, revocation by the servient owner, B, released by the dominant tenement owner, C, prescription by the servient owner, or D, merger of both the servient and dominant parcels. William Fiedler confirms, yes, schools can hold property in a trust. So I'm not sure if you're talking about public or private there, but if it's private, then that's pretty much the same thing as a corporation. Nice job. A lot of active discussion today. Love your guys' energy this morning. Or this afternoon, depending on where in the country you are. We are not time discriminatory here. If you're 3 hours older than me, I'm not going to hold it against you. So an easement appurtenant to real property can be terminated by all of the following except revocation by the servient owner. So looks like most of us were comfortable with that, but a few people were guessing, a few people were not quite sure. So to dominate an easement, really sort of any easement, they can be released by the dominant tenement owner. If any of you have been to one of my property ownership webinars before, you may know this. How can a dominant tenement owner release an easement, release the servient tenement from an easement? Any idea? It is a paper. It is a type of deed. I will give you that hint there. There is a type of deed that can terminate an easement. Any ideas? I'm going to give you a few more seconds to come up with that. See if you have any ideas. Blanca, hit it on the head. Brandy right behind. A quitclaim deed. So a dominant tenement owner can sign a quitclaim deed regarding their easement to release the servient tenement from the easement. This next one here, prescription by the servient owner. We just talked about that when we're talking about prescriptive easements. We're talking about time. So if you were granted a prescriptive easement for using a particular plot of land for 7 years straight, and then you don't use it for 7 years straight, you could lose the easement, right? So in the same way that you can be given an easement by prescription, you can lose the easement by prescription. Namisha says stop use is revoking by prescription. Exactly. And Beth, revocation by the servient owner just means that the person who owns the servient tenement, that would be if they could somehow revoke the easement, right? So that would be if Julio has a dominant tenement and I'm the servient tenement and I say, I revoke your right to use my land. That would be revocation by the servient owner, and that's not allowed. Sorry. If you're the servient owner of a land that has an easement running over it, that's just the way it is. You cannot tell that easement to go away. And then this last way that you can terminate an easement is to merge both the servient and dominant tenements. So if the dominant tenement or if the servient tenement buys the other property and then merges those two parcels of land together, that will terminate an easement. Flygirl Ray despises accept questions. I totally get that. And part of the reason that you see a lot of them in your practice exams is because there's still a common question format on real estate exams. So this is really just about, reading the question carefully and completely. Flygirl Ray says, have to study this a bit more. I wouldn't spend a ton of time on it, Flygirl Ray, other than to know that you can revoke an easement and that the person who is the servient owner, the servient tenement, is the only party that cannot revoke the easement. Only the dominant tenement can revoke the easement or release the easement. But my understanding is that doesn't come up tons on most real estate exams. So I would not recommend you guys spend tons of time on that. Just know the basics of how they work, all right? Last question of the day. Oscar, Andrew, and Douglas are joint tenants owning a parcel of land. Douglas conveys his interest to his longtime friend Joe. After the conveyance, Oscar and Andrew A. continue to be joint tenants with Douglas, B. become joint tenants with Joe, C. become tenants in common, or D. remain joint tenants owning a 2/3 interest. Kind of going back to the last question a little, Namisha says a license can be revoked by the person granting it. That is very true. I almost put a question about that in here, but then I thought we covered very similar things. And for those of you who aren't sure, the difference between an easement and a license is that a license is voluntary, the voluntary giving of permission. So with a license, you're saying, you know what, I can see that you need to use my land to get to the lake. I'm totally cool with that. I'm just going to grant you a license to do that. However, licenses can be taken away very easily. Easements, on the other hand, are usually granted by a court or some other sort of action to make them legal. And because it has all that bureaucratic red tape to make it legal, requires a lot of bureaucratic red tape to make it go away. Right. For this question, Oscar, Andrew, and Douglas are joint tenants owning a parcel of land. Douglas conveys his interest to his longtime friend Joe. After the conveyance, Oscar and Andrew remain joint tenants owning a 2/3 interest. What is what is Joe's interest ownership called? Oh, Namisha beat me to it. Joe is a tenant in common. Naz Salimi says, after the conveyance is what tricks the perspective here. Absolutely. It's a huge part of this question. Because after the conveyance, for those of you that are familiar, for those of you who have encountered this type of situation before, if you start as a joint tenant, that means you have the unities of time, title, interest, and possession with your fellow joint tenants. Well, when Douglas conveys his interest to his longtime friend Joe, now Joe no longer shares the unity of time with Oscar and Andrew, so he can't be a joint tenant, does not have the unity of time anymore. And so just legally in most places, that ownership interest is going to convert to a tenancy in common. That is sort of the default, what do they call it, concurrent ownership type. So looks like everybody got that. That's going to do it for today, everybody. Thanks for a great learning session. I feel like we covered a lot of great stuff. And I want to wish good luck to everybody who has their exams coming up. And I want to thank everybody for thanking me, and also just to remind you, to do that for the others in your life that you know that have served in the military. Even those of us like myself who served during really peace times and never had to put my life in danger, there's still a long-term effect, and the thanks that you all give really does mean a lot. So much appreciated. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow at Thursday. Tomorrow is Thursday, but tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And I don't remember off the top of my head what we're going to be talking about. Let's take a look real quick. Tomorrow is Laws of Agency, so get yourself excited for that. Have a great rest of your day. Appreciate y'all. Take care.